This podcast is part of the Frederick Podcast Network. Learn more at listenfrederick.com.
Welcome back to Mental Health and Me. Thank you so much for tuning into season 5. I'm really excited to be back in the studio. And I thought about different ways I wanted to start this season. And there's something I've wanted to do for a while, something I wanted to talk about. So I decided to jump in with this. And that would be the Milgram Experiment. And if you don't know what that is, you may want to pause this podcast and go watch some clips of it on YouTube, because this podcast is filled with spoiler alerts. But I think that that particular experiment is very important because we live it out every day, whether we realize it or not. The overview of the Milgram experiment is that it was something that was done in the early 1960s at Yale University. It was conducted by Stanley Milgram, and the whole idea was to understand obedience to authority. You looked at this experiment and you said, how far would people go? How far would they go against their own conscience, essentially, just to listen to the person in authority? So what happens is participants come in, and this experiment was very controversial and will not be replicated because it was a psychological experiment that was done without consent. The people thought they were coming in for something else, and in the process, they became part of this experiment. But what they did is they came in and they were assigned a role, and all the real participants were actually assigned this role, which was called teacher, but they thought it was random, but that's kind of what happened. And they come in and they are supposed to believe, and they do, that they're administering electric shocks to another person when they give incorrect answers. They think that this is an experiment that's supposed to test people's ability to memorize things with sort of a punitive piece, which would be the electric shock. So the person they believe they're shocking is behind a curtain. They can't actually see them, but they can hear them. So you have this person who's called the teacher. That's the person who is the real participant. You have somebody who is called a learner, and that's someone who is an actor, and they're pretending to be shocked behind the curtain. And then you have the experimenter, who seems like a nice enough guy, quite honestly. He's wearing a white lab coat, looks professional, but he's never mean. He's never authoritarian. He just simply tells you what to do. So this procedure, which always really interests me, is that you increase the shock levels. This is what the person believes they're doing, is increasing the shock levels from 15 volts to 450 volts. Every time you get a wrong answer, it's a higher shock value. They even shock the teacher, the participant, who doesn't know what's going on. They shock them so they understand it's a pretty high voltage. It hurts. It is not fun. And so you realize you are administering pain to the other person. Now, the person behind the curtain, it's actually just a pre-recorded thing. And every volt, every time they get shocked, they start saying, stop it, let me out of here. I don't want to do this. Eventually, they fall completely silent. And what's so significant in this experiment is that the person, the teacher, right, the person who is the true psychological experiment, they will sometimes beg the experimenter, the authority figure, they will sometimes say, hey, I don't want to do this anymore. The person behind there sounds like they're in distress. You need to check on them. They sound like they're in a lot of pain. I don't want to do this. And the experimenter, the person in the white lab coat, who is the authority figure, very calmly just says, the experiment requires that you continue. They never threaten them. They never berate them. They simply just tell them, keep going. It's important you keep doing this. There's a reason for it. So the person in the other room is, like we said, not a real person, but you can see marked distress on the person who's administering the shocks. They're getting very upset. Now, they keep going all the way through, and at the end, they do find out, hey, you didn't actually electrocute someone. But they continued to do the experiment, and actually 65% of the people, of the participants, administered the maximum 450 volt shock, even though they thought the other person was in significant distress, even to the point they weren't saying anything. They said, this person might be passed out back there. They might be dead. Yet they continued to do the voltage shock. Only 65% did the 450, but every single participant went up to at least 300 volts. So why do I tell you all this? You say, I would never do that, right? I would absolutely never shock somebody. I would not distress someone. If I thought it was wrong, I wouldn't do it. Would you? I think the Milgram experiment is very important because it applies to us today. Not all that long ago, something happened to a member of my family. And even though the people doing it knew better, their conscience would have told them it was the wrong decision, their experience, their wisdom in their field would have told them, hey, this is not the correct way to handle this. They did it anyway. And I said, well, you're simply just a victim of the Milgram experiment. You're the person on the other side of the curtain getting shocked. The people who are doing it don't really want to do it, but they don't understand that they're doing it because an authority figure told them to, and they seem to lack the ability to pull themselves out of the experiment. This is why this experiment is so important, is that we see ourselves in different roles. If you're the person in the white lab coat and no one ever pushes up against you, you tell someone to do it, they do it without question, you assume you're always right. Well, you're an incorrect participant in the Milgram experiment. The person in the white lab coat is not the good guy here or the bad guy. They have to have the sense to realize you're not always getting it right. You need the people in your world to tell you, hey, just because you told me to do this doesn't mean it's the right decision. Sometimes we see this as parents. I would say I've been that person in a parental role. I've decided that this was the best way to handle something, and my kids said no. They maybe said for whatever reason that they disagreed or something, and it's caused me to rethink my position. Not every time, but the idea is that the person in the white lab coat in reality needs to rethink what they're doing and decide if they are welcome to criticism and open to that. The second person, the person who is doing the zapping, they had a choice. They have a choice the entire time. For some reason, the psychological piece is that I don't have a choice. This person in authority told me to do it. But you do have a choice. They could have stopped at any time. Now, often, if we are that person, it will come with a cost. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying you won't have to sacrifice for it. In this experiment, those people were paid some monetary amount. It wasn't a ton of money. But if they would have quit, they would have lost the check. Now, that doesn't seem to be the reason that most people continued. The reason most people continued was because they truly believe they had to for the sake of the experiment. But for us, sometimes if you're the person hurting another person, you may have to say, I'm not going to do that. You can't actually make me do that. If I think it is wrong, I will not do it. See, I'm at that position in my life now. I haven't always been. I've worked at jobs where I was coerced or convinced. I've been in positions where someone has told me to do that, and I did it even though my gut told me it was the wrong decision. I don't do that now, but I certainly used to. Corporate America loves this, right? We love to make the lower people do the dirty work, that type of thing. I'm sure you've heard that, and I'm sure you've seen that play out. But you need to remember that if you are the person zapping someone else, you don't actually have to do it. It might cost you, but you still don't have to do something that's against your conscience. Then we have the person on the other side. I think we've all also been that person who's getting zapped, right? And saying, what the heck? How could this many people be willing to do this to me? Nobody stood up and said that this is wrong. Nobody stopped the process. I've been in that position too, where I've seen this play out and just said, what the heck? How could you possibly just allow this? But when we understand the Milgram experiment, we understand that people who are not aware that this experiment is always going on. It's going on in your household. It's going on at your job. It's going on in any group you're part of. When we are part of the Milgram experiment, which we all are, you have to see which role you are. The goal is to be that fourth role who's super aware. The person who sees what's playing out and says, no, I'm not going to be part of this. Often that creates a pause. See, that was the other thing that was really significant in the Milgram experiment is that they really kept making the person continue. There was not time, there was not space given to take a pause and say, let's reassess, let's relook at what our goal is here. Instead, there's always this pressure. You got to keep going. You've got to do it now. It's very important. This is what's best for the company. This is what's best for the family. This is what's best for the job. This is what's best for the experiment. You have to do it. The authority in this situation overpowers our moral judgment. So as a parent, a time that I can think of that me and my husband were the person in authority is one time when my daughter was really little. She was like 3 years old, and she was handing us her plate. Okay, it was a Mickey Mouse shaped head plate. And some macaroni fell off of the plate onto the floor. And she picked it up and didn't know what to do with it. She was little. And she looked at my husband, and my husband said, "It's fine, just put it in the ear." And he meant put it in the ear of the Mickey Mouse. But she looked at us just kind of blankly and started to put the macaroni noodle in her actual ear. And we laughed and we're like, no, no, the ear of the plate. But I thought, what a great example of the Milgram experiment. Here is a kid who clearly knows this is not something that makes sense. But hey, the person in authority told me to do it. So I'm going to do it. Right. And so it's one of those things that I feel like this experiment has played out in our lives, our entire existence, whether we know it or not. And it still plays out today. Now, I feel that, and part of it's probably from being a therapist, but I feel like my ethics are pretty strong. At this point, I think nothing of telling someone, no, I won't do that. I won't say that. I won't participate in that. I don't believe in that. I'm really confident, but I'm 39. When I was 20, I tried to not be the squeaky wheel. I tried to go along and do what was best and be a team player. And when you're in the Milgram experiment, I just think you need to recognize that the person in authority is not always right, and they're also sometimes getting you to do what they don't want to do. That's really important. I mean, have you ever done something because the person above you just didn't want to do it themselves? Because I have. Not anymore, but I certainly have. Now, the Milgram experiment, I didn't even find out about or learn about till college, which is kind of shocking. And I really just like this whole way this experiment played out. I think it's very educational. So I decided to set my children down and have them watch the experiment. And I had them watch it in a way that they did not know the true outcome. There were no spoilers. And I just observed them and I told them, I said, I want you to share with me while you're watching this. Share with me what you're thinking, and I'm just going to take some notes and watch this play out. Maybe they'll talk to their therapist about this experience one day. I don't really know because, maybe it wasn't the nicest thing, but I did tell them at the end what happened. But they watched this kind of go on and they had their own feedback. And I would say that something that was really interesting is, well, they wondered how the person kept getting it wrong because that was the deal. If you got it wrong, you got zapped. And they were very confused. And the kids were trying to like yell the correct answer because they didn't want the guy to get zapped anymore. But they also said, one of them said, doesn't he just get up and leave? Why doesn't he just get up? And I think that's kind of the most obvious is if you're watching the experiment, the person sitting in the chair zapping is not tied in. They don't have a gun to their head. They're just doing it. But when we're looking at it from the outside, we can say all they had to do was just stop. We looked at the reason that they were doing it. Were they doing this because they were financially motivated? Not really. They were doing it simply more because they had to. At the end of the experiment, I asked my kids, so who was to blame? Who was to blame for this situation, for what happened? And they had, a great discussion on this. And they'd say, well, some of them thought maybe it was the person who was doing the zapping. Some of them thought it was the person in authority who even orchestrated the experiment to begin with. We could debate that all day. It really comes down to this personal responsibility that you don't have to. But for my kids, I think the question that knocked me on my heels that made me most concerned is I said, if you agree to be part of something, do you have the right to change your mind? And two of the kids said no, and one of them said yes. And I thought, oh, this is how this experiment goes awry. We have got to understand that just because you agreed to do something, you are allowed to change your mind. We came from, at least in my generation, it was you never quit, never stop a job till it's done, blah, blah, blah. Those are great adages if it comes to a work ethic, maybe for something of true value. But if you agree to be part of a company, or if you agree to be part of a project or a group or a club, and they start to do things that are against your moral compass, you are not obligated to stay being a part of something. The never quit mentality is not healthy. When something is not lining up with what you believe to be correct, quit. Don't do it. You don't want to have to live with those decisions because they're ultimately your decisions. And when we had this conversation, one of my kids says, but what if people are counting on you? Well, then you let them down. Sometimes you let people down. That's not fun to do, But I've also normalized that in my own life. I've normalized that with my kids. They're going to make decisions that let me down. I'm going to do things that let other people down. I'm a strong person. I work hard for people. I do my best, but I also sort of have my own boundaries and my own lines, right? And we don't want to just say that someone's counting on me. I have to do it because people are going to let you down. You need to normalize that for yourself. And then you need to normalize you're going to let people down also. You have to remember when you look at the Milgram experiment that there were so many choices that every time that person hit the buzzer, there was a choice. And to the people, the 65% who believed they administered a 450-volt shock, they just seemed to not be able to stop themselves because there was no completion. They were so relieved when they did the last shock. Oh, thank goodness it's done. But it could have been done at any time. You could have just said, nope, that person says they don't want to be zapped anymore. Therefore, I'm not going to do it. I think that if you look at the Milgram experiment, it does, sit poorly in your stomach. I mean, if you're watching this and don't know what's happening, it is horrifying to watch. But I want you to realize that same experiment is happening every day, all the time. You are part of that experiment every week of your life, whether you realize it or not. So the next time you're in a situation where it feels like you can't speak up or you can't push back, where you have to do something you don't want to do, I want you to think of the Milgram experiment. And I want you to think about the choices you have, the outcome if you do something you don't want to do, and maybe it costs you to not do that thing, but that's all right. You'll be okay, right? I think that we want to just hold to this experiment as truth. It's not that long ago it was done, the 1960s. That's not that long ago. But that experiment has been going on since the dawn of time. The idea is that the person in the white lab coat tells you it, and therefore you believe it's gospel truth. And I don't think we should do that. So there's a difference between saying, hey, I'm not going to listen to any authority and anarchy and all that. I'm not advocating that we do this, but I'm just advocating in your personal world, in your life, in your job, in your club, your group, your organization, whatever it might be, that you have the courage to take a step back from the Milgram experiment, not be any of the initial three people, but instead be this fourth character that recognizes it's happening and makes the decision that you're going to be happy with in the end. Thank you for tuning into Mental Health and Me today. Find me on Instagram at Natalie Souders _. Until next time.
Live radio, local podcasts, the Frederick Podcast Network at listenfrederick.com.